What happens when the most powerful mafia boss in the city comes face to face with the bully who once destroyed his spirit? You'd expect a violent execution, a bloodbath that leaves the walls stained red. Han Jae-Wook's men already had their suppressed pistols aimed at his head, but his reaction sent shock waves through the entire underworld. Jae-Wook didn't reach for his gun. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he gave him a mercy more terrifying than death. He made him his shadow. In the cold, steel-end glass heart of the Seoul underworld, Han Jae-Wook's word is law. They call him the architect of silence. He has built an empire on the bodies of those who dared to cross him. But standing in his penthouse office today, looking at the man trembling on his knees with a mop in his hand, Jae-Wook wasn't a mafia boss. For a split second, he was that 12-year-old boy again, shivering in a dark school locker while this very man laughed at his tears. 20 years have passed. Jae-Wook is a god of the city and Lee Bong-Gu is a ghost cleaning his floors. The air in the room turned to ice. Jae-Wook's bodyguards waited for the signal to end him, but as he looked into those hollow, desperate eyes, he realized something that changed him forever. Killing him would be an exit, keeping him alive. That would be his masterpiece. The golden elevator doors hissed open, revealing a sanctuary of glass and steel that hovered nearly 100 stories above the smog of Seoul. This was the summit of the underworld, a world where the air itself felt thin and expensive. Han Jae-Wook stepped out, his handmade Italian Oxfords clicking against the polished black marble with a rhythmic, predatory precision. To his left and right, rows of men in charcoal suits, stiff, silent, and lethal, bowed in a perfect, synchronized arc. They didn't just respect him. They feared the very space he occupied, as if his shadow alone could crush their breath. Jae-Wook didn't acknowledge them. He didn't have to. Power, in its purest form, is the ability to ignore the world around you because you already own every corner of it. He adjusted the cuff of his silk shirt, the heavy weight of a gold Patek Philippe glinting under the amber recessed lighting. Every detail of his appearance was a calculated strike. The razor-sharp part in his slick-back hair, the tailored black overcoat that draped like armor, and the cold, unreadable depths of his eyes. A subtle dragon's tail, inked in deep indigo, peeked from beneath his collar, a reminder of the violence he had survived to reach this height. He walked toward the massive mahogany desk that anchored the room, a piece of furniture that had seen more death warrants signed than a courthouse. Behind him, the city stretched out like a carpet of flickering neon jewels, but Jae-Wook kept his back to it. He didn't need to look at the city to know he controlled its pulse. He could feel the vibrations of his empire in the soles of his feet. He sat, the premium leather of his chair creaking softly in the absolute, heavy silence of the room. His lieutenants stood at a distance, breath held, waiting for a word, a nod, or a glance. Jae-Wook picked up a fountain pen, its gold nib reflecting the cold light of the office. In this room, a single stroke of that pen could collapse a shipping conglomerate or erase a rival family from the map. He was the architect of silence, not because he was mute, but because when he spoke, the world stopped to listen. There was no warmth here, only the refrigerated chill of a man who had stripped away his humanity to build a fortress of status. He was untouchable, wrapped in a layer of wealth so thick that the common struggles of the streets below felt like a distant, fading memory. He had successfully buried the boy he used to be under a mountain of gold and blood. Or so he believed, until the doors to the service entrance creaked open. The heavy silence of the penthouse was usually reserved for life-and-death decisions, but today it was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cologne. Han Jae-Wook sat at the head of the obsidian conference table, his presence pinning the rival syndicate leaders to their seats. Millions of dollars were being moved with nothing more than a shallow nod or a flick of his gold-ringed finger. The tension was a living thing, coiled and ready to strike. Then the world tilted. A sudden, wet thud echoed against the marble walls, followed by the metallic clatter of a plastic bucket. Before Jae-Wook's lieutenants could even react, a wave of murky, gray dishwater surged across the floor, drenching the $5,000 Italian leather of Jae-Wook's shoes. The architect of silence didn't flinch, but his eyes went cold, turning into 2 chips of black ice. At his feet, a man collapsed into a heap of damp rags in desperation. Lee Bong-Gu, hidden behind the anonymity of a faded blue janitor's uniform, was already trembling so violently that the water still in the bucket splashed in rhythm with his heartbeat. He didn't look up. He couldn't. He knew the protocol of this floor. To touch the chairman was a mistake. To soil him was a death sentence. I'm sorry. Please. Chairman, the janitor stammered, his voice a pathetic, gravelly rasp that barely cut through the sudden, suffocating stillness of the room. He reached out with a filthy, sud-soaked cloth, instinctively trying to wipe the water from Jae-Wook's loafers, his hands shaking with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. Around the table, the rival bosses held their breath. Jae-Wook's personal guard, a man whose shadow was made of lead and gunpowder, stepped forward, his hand disappearing beneath the flap of his tailored jacket. The air in the penthouse seemed to exit the room, leaving a vacuum of pure, unfiltered dread. In this building, men had been erased for looking at Jae-Wook the wrong way. A janitor ruining his appearance in front of his enemies wasn't just a mistake, it was an insult that demanded blood. Jae-Wook looked down. He didn't see the water and he didn't see the mess. He watched the way the janitor's shoulders hunched, the way his thinning hair clung to a sweaty forehead, and the way he groveled in the dirt. There was something hauntingly familiar in that cowardice, a ghost of a rhythm he had heard decades ago. The room was waiting for the signal to execute, but for the first time in 10 years, Han Jae-Wook felt the ghost of a cold shiver crawl up his spine. The heavy silence of the penthouse was broken only by the rhythmic, wet slap of a rag hitting the marble. Han Jae-Wook didn't flinch when the gray water splattered across his shoes. He didn't roar in anger, nor did he signal the guards who had already moved like shadows to surround the intruder. Instead, he simply stopped. He looked down at the dark stain on his leather footwear, then at the trembling back of the man on all fours. The janitor was hyperventilating, his ragged breath echoing off the glass walls. He was a broken shell of a man, his spine curved by years of labor and defeat. Jae-Wook felt a strange, cold pull in his chest, a ghost of a sensation he hadn't felt in 2 decades. Slow and deliberate, the chairman descended. He didn't mind the filth on the floor as he lowered himself into a crouch, his movements possessing the terrifying grace of a predator cornering a wounded animal. He reached out. His hand, adorned with a heavy gold signet ring and the faint edge of a tattoo, moved through the air with agonizing slowness. He gripped the man's chin. His fingers pressed firmly into the weathered, sweaty skin, a display of controlled dominance that forced the janitor's head upward. As the man's face was dragged into the light, the amber glow of the chandelier caught the jagged, pale scar running across his upper lip. Jae-Wook's breath caught, though his face remained a mask of stone. He looked into those glossy, fearful eyes he had once seen through a haze of tears and blood in a dark school locker. The world outside the glass mansion seemed to vanish. The high-stakes meeting, the empire, the millions of dollars on the line, it all dissolved. In the sharp micro-contrast of the room's cinematic lighting, the truth was undeniable. The pathetic, middle-aged man shivering in a stained uniform wasn't just a clumsy laborer. He was Lee Bong-Gu. He was the monster who had spent years convincing a young Jae-Wook that he was nothing. He was the devil who had forged Jae-Wook's cruelty in the fires of the school boiler room. Bong-Gu's jaw was tight, his breath hitching as he stared up at the man holding his life in his hands. He didn't recognize the boy yet, but he recognized the power. He saw death staring back at him through Jae-Wook's icy, unblinking gaze. For Jae-Wook, the recognition was a thunderclap in a graveyard. The predator had become the prey, and the boy who was once broken was now the god who would decide if this man ever saw the sun rise again. The pristine marble of the penthouse began to blur, the sharp amber lights bleeding into a cold, suffocating gray. The hum of the skyscraper's ventilation died away, replaced by the rhythmic, metallic dripping of a leaky pipe in a cramped, concrete basement. Suddenly, the air was no longer expensive. It was thick with the smell of rust, coal dust, and fear. 24 years collapsed in a heartbeat. 12-year-old Jae-Wook was curled into a ball on the damp floor of the school's boiler room, his oversized uniform torn and stained with soot. Above him stood a shadow that blocked out the only light from the hallway, a young, pharaoh Lee Bong-Gu. In those days, Bong-Gu didn't have a janitor's limp or a desperate gaze. He had the broad shoulders of a predator who had never known a day of consequence. "Please," Jae-Wook whispered, his voice cracking with a terror that made the older boys laugh. Bong-Gu didn't answer with words. He answered with the heavy thud of a boot against Jae-Wook's ribs. He took a carton of spoiled milk and poured it slowly over the boy's head, watching with a sadistic, wide-eyed grin as the sour liquid soaked into Jae-Wook's hair and stung his eyes. To Bong-Gu, this wasn't just a fight, it was sport. He wasn't just hurting a classmate, he was systematically dismantling a human soul for the sheer, intoxicating rush of it. "Look at me when I'm breaking you," Bong-Gu had hissed, grabbing Jae-Wook by the hair and slamming his head against the hot iron of the boiler. "You're a nothing, Jae-Wook. You're a bug. In 20 years I'll be king and you'll still be crawling in the dirt." The memory pulsed with the heat of that boiler. The vibration of the scream Jae-Wook was too terrified to let out, and the feeling of his spirit snapping like dry glass. Bong-Gu had stood there, towering and triumphant, convinced that his victim would never rise again. He had left Jae-Wook in the dark, bleeding and smelling of sour milk, believing that power was something you took with your fists. The desaturated haze began to ripple. The sound of the dripping pipe transformed back into the silent, pressurized atmosphere of the penthouse. The small, broken boy in the soot-stained uniform vanished, replaced by a man in a tailored overcoat whose gold watch ticked with the cold finality of a countdown. Jae-Wook's eyes snapped back into focus, locking onto the pathetic, aging man trembling before him. The cycle was complete. The king had become the bug, and the dirt was waiting. The temperature in the penthouse didn't just drop, it vanished. As Jae-Wook's fingers remained clamped on Bong-Gu's chin, the air turned into a vacuum of suffocating pressure. His lieutenants, men trained to read the slightest flicker of his pulse, didn't need an order. They recognized the predatory stillness that preceded a storm. In a blur of synchronized motion, 3 suppressed pistols were drawn, their muzzles leveled with surgical precision. Small, crimson laser dots appeared on Bong-Gu's chest, dancing over his tattered janitor's uniform like restless fireflies. One settled directly over his heart, another pulsed against the hollow of his throat. The metallic snick of safeties being disengaged echoed through the vaulted lobby, a sound that usually signaled the end of a life. Bong-Gu's breathing became a series of jagged, wet gasps. He stared up into Jae-Wook's eyes that were as deep and cold as an Arctic trench. In that terrifying proximity, the fog of age and desperation finally cleared from Bong-Gu's mind. He saw the sharp, familiar line of the jaw and the icy, unwavering resolve he had tried to kick out of a boy 2 decades ago. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The mop fell from his numb fingers, clattering loudly against the marble. Jae-Wook, he wheezed, the name tasting like ash. The man holding his life in his hands didn't blink. The grip on his chin tightened just enough to bruise, a controlled display of the strength Bong-Gu had once mocked. Bong-Gu's eyes darted from the gold watch on Jae-Wook's wrist to the red dots burning into his own skin. The internal collapse was visible, his shoulders slumped, and the last vestige of his pride drained away, replaced by a primal, shaking terror. He wasn't just facing a mafia boss. He was facing the ghost of his own cruelty, now grown into a giant that cast a shadow over the entire city. The guards stood like statues, their gazes fixed on the back of Jae-Wook's head, waiting for the nearly imperceptible nod that would send Bong-Gu into the abyss. The silence in the building was absolute, a heavy, ringing quiet that felt like it would never end. Every person in that lobby held their breath, caught in the gravity of a debt that was 20 years overdue. The silence in the penthouse was no longer empty. It was heavy, suffocating like a physical weight pressing the air out of Lee Bong-Gu's lungs. Jae-Wook didn't move his hand from the man's chin. His grip remained firm, a controlled display of dominance that forced Bong-Gu to maintain eye contact. The chairman leaned in, his face inches from the man who was now hyperventilating, the smell of cheap floor cleaner clashing with Jae-Wook's expensive sandalwood cologne. "March 14th, Jae-Wook whispered. The voice was soft, almost intimate, yet it cut through the room like a piano wire. "It was raining that Tuesday, wasn't it, Bong-Gu? The school boiler room didn't have a heater. It was cold, but not as cold as the water you poured down my back while you held the door shut." Bong-Gu's eyes widened, a flicker of horrific realization finally piercing through his shock. The name, the date, the memory. His jaw trembled against Jae-Wook's palm, a low, pathetic whimper escaping his throat. He looked at the tailored overcoat, the gold watch, and the icy, predatory eyes of the man holding his life in the balance. He wasn't looking at a mafia boss anymore. He was looking at the ghost of the boy he had broken for sport 20 years ago. "You probably don't remember the sound my ribs made when you kicked me," Jae-Wook continued, his tone devoid of any heat, which made it 10 times more terrifying. "You probably forgot that you told me I'd never be anything more than a dog for people like you to kick. You forgot because for you, it was just a Tuesday. For you, I was a nobody." Jae-Wook's thumb traced the line of Bong-Gu's trembling lip, a gesture that looked almost like a caress if not for the lethal stillness in his gaze. "But I never forgot. Every morning for 7,305 days, I woke up with the phantom ache of that boiler room floor in my bones. Every deal I closed, every rival I removed, every brick of this empire I built. I did it with your face in my mind." The chairman let out a short, dry breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "I spent 20 years becoming a god just so that one day, when the universe finally brought you to my feet, you would realize the truth. You didn't just create a monster, Bong-Gu. You created your owner." Jae-Wook finally released his grip, but Bong-Gu didn't move. He remained frozen, his spirit visibly shattering as the weight of his insignificance settled over him. He wasn't being killed, he was being erased. The tension in the penthouse was thick enough to choke the air out of the room. Every one of Jae-Wook's lieutenants stood like a statue, their suppressed pistols leveled with predatory focus at Lee Bong-Gu's head. The laser sights burned small, crimson holes into the janitor's tattered uniform, marking the exact spots where lead would soon tear through flesh. Bong-Gu had stopped breathing. His eyes were squeezed shut, his entire body convulsing in the rhythmic, pathetic tremors of a man who knew he was seconds away from the abyss. He was waiting for the roar of gunfire, for the sudden darkness, for the final payment of a 20-year-old debt. But the roar never came. Jae-Wook remained motionless for a heartbeat longer, his hand still clamped like a vice around Bong-Gu's chin. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, he released his grip. He didn't shove the man away, he simply let go, as if Bong-Gu were a piece of trash that had finally lost its interest. Jae-Wook stood up, the joints of his tailored suit settling perfectly as he regained his full, towering height. The room held its collective breath. The guards' fingers tightened on their triggers, their eyes darting to Jae-Wook's face, searching for the slight tilt of the head or the subtle blink that served as his signal to kill. Instead, Jae-Wook reached out and calmly brushed a stray fleck of dust from his black overcoat. The gesture was terrifyingly casual. "Holster your weapons," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a razor through silk. The lead lieutenant hesitated, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Chairman." "I said," Jae-Wook repeated, his eyes never leaving the shivering wreck on the floor. "Put them away. All of them." A series of metallic clicks echoed through the lobby as, one by one, the guards obeyed. The confusion in the room was palpable, a heavy wave of disbelief that rippled through the ranks of the city's most dangerous men. They had seen Jae-Wook order the execution of entire families for minor slights, yet here he was, standing over the man who had dared to soil his presence, and he was choosing restraint. Jae-Wook looked down at Bong-Gu, who had finally opened his eyes, staring up in a daze of disbelief and terror. The boss didn't look angry. He looked bored. By refusing to pull the trigger, Jae-Wook had achieved the ultimate subversion of power. He had decided that Lee Bong-Gu was not a threat to be eliminated, but a tool to be repurposed. The building remained in a haunting, heavy silence, realizing that their leader had found a way to inflict a wound that no bullet could ever reach. Jae-Wook stood slowly, the fabric of his tailored trousers snapping into place with a crisp, expensive sound. He smoothed the front of his overcoat, his movements devoid of the frantic energy that usually preceded a mafia execution. The silence in the penthouse was so absolute that the distant hum of the city's traffic felt like a roar. His lieutenants remained frozen, their fingers still hovering near the triggers of their weapons, their eyes darting between the boss and the pathetic, shivering heap of a man on the floor. "Put them away," Jae-Wook said, his voice a calm velvet blade. "We aren't barbarians." A ripple of confusion crossed the faces of his men, but the pistols vanished beneath silk linings instantly. Jae-Wook looked down at Bong-Gu, who was gasping for air, his face wet with a mixture of soapy water and terrified tears. The chairman reached into his pocket and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief, tossing it onto the wet marble. "You've been cleaning the lobby, haven't you, Bong-Gu?" Jae-Wook asked, his tone almost conversational. "A man of your talents shouldn't be wasted on public spaces. From today you are promoted. You will no longer touch the rest of this building. You will clean only this office, only my floors, only when I am here to watch." Bong-Gu looked up, his jaw trembling. He expected a bullet, a beating, or a trip to the docks in a concrete suit. This felt like a trick. "I'm doubling your salary," Jae-Wook continued, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a smile that never reached his frozen eyes. "In fact, I'll triple it. You have a family, don't you? Debts. I'll ensure you are the highest paid janitor in the history of this country. You'll have more money than you ever dreamed of while you were making my life hell in middle school." Jae-Wook leaned down, his gold watch catching the light, blinding the smaller man. "But there is a condition. You will never quit. You will arrive before I do. And you will leave only when I dismiss you. Every day you will scrub the spot where I stand. Every day you will look at me and remember who I am, and more importantly, who you've become." The mercy hit Bong-Gu harder than a physical blow. It was a life sentence in a cage made of gold and shame. To refuse meant death. To accept meant a daily, agonizing reminder of his own insignificance. He was being bought, owned, and displayed like a conquered trophy. Jae-Wook turned his back, returning to his mahogany desk as if the man on the floor had already ceased to be human and had become merely a piece of the furniture. "Clean the water, Bong-Gu," he whispered. "You're on the clock." The atmosphere within the headquarters shifted, hardening into something far more pressurized than mere fear. In the days following the encounter, a heavy, reverent silence draped itself over the glass mansion like a shroud. The rumors traveled through the city's concrete veins, from the smoke-filled gambling dens of Gangnam to the shipping docks of Incheon, whispering of the chairman's mercy. To the street-level thugs, a bullet was a standard currency, a simple transaction of life for death. But what Han Jae-Wook had done was something far more ancient and terrifying. He hadn't just defeated an enemy, he had annexed a man's soul. Inside the penthouse, the air was thick with a new kind of tension. Jae-Wook's lieutenants, men who had grown comfortable with the sight of blood, now moved with a hushed, ghost-like precision. They watched the janitor, Lee Bong-Gu, as he shuffled through the corridors with his head perpetually bowed, his eyes never rising above the level of Jae-Wook's waist. He was no longer a man. He was a walking monument to the chairman's absolute dominance. Every time Bong-Gu dipped his rag into the bucket or scrubbed a corner of the marble floor, he was a living reminder that under Jae-Wook's rule, death was an escape you weren't always granted. Jae-Wook's reputation underwent a cold, surgical transformation. He was no longer seen merely as a violent predator, but as something approaching a dark deity. His men began to realize that their boss didn't just want their obedience. He wanted their total psychological surrender. They saw how he looked at Bong-Gu, not with hatred, but with a chilling, detached pity. It was the look a child gives a broken toy he has decided to keep rather than throw away. This calm mercy became the ultimate deterrent. It sent a message to every rival and every subordinate. If you cross Han Jae-Wook, he won't just end your life. He will take your pride, your history, and your future, and he will make you earn a living by polishing the very throne you tried to topple. As Jae-Wook sat in his office, the rhythmic sound of Bong-Gu's brush against the floor became the heartbeat of the building. The architect of silence had designed his masterpiece, and the entire underworld stood still, terrified to breathe. The sun was setting over Seoul, bleeding a deep, bruised purple across the horizon. From the 75th floor, the city looked like a circuit board of flickering neon, beautiful and cold. Han Jae-Wook stood with his back to the room, his reflection ghost-like against the floor-to-ceiling glass. He looked like the king of a world made of light and shadow, yet his attention wasn't on the empire he had built. It was on the rhythmic, wet sound of a brush hitting marble behind him. In the reflection, he watched Lee Bong-Gu. The man who had once been a titan of terror in a middle school hallway was now a small, shivering shape on his hands and knees. Bong-Gu scrubbed with a desperate, frantic energy, his knuckles white and his breath coming in ragged hitches. Every time Jae-Wook's reflection shifted, Bong-Gu flinched, his entire body tensing as if expecting a blow that never came. Jae-Wook looked at his own hands, the gold ring, the subtle ink, the steady grip of a man who held the life of thousands in his palm. For 20 years he had carried a knot of barbed wire in his chest, a burning need to see this man suffer, to hear his bones snap, to erase the memory of the boiler room with blood. He had expected that seeing Bong-Gu like this would bring a rush of adrenaline, a surge of dark triumph. But as he watched the old bully struggle to wring out a dirty cloth, Jae-Wook felt something far more profound. Nothing. The rage that had fueled his ascent, the fire that had forged the architect of silence, had simply flickered out. He realized that Bong-Gu wasn't a monster. He wasn't a demon. He was just a pathetic, aging man whose only power had been the fear of a child. By granting him this mercy, Jae-Wook hadn't just enslaved his enemy, he had liberated himself. The weak boy who used to cry in the locker was finally dead, but he hadn't been killed by violence. He had been healed by the realization that his predator was now completely, utterly insignificant. Jae-Wook didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He simply exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry away 2 decades of ghosts. The silence in the building was no longer heavy with tension. It was settled. It was peaceful. Behind him, the sound of the scrubbing continued, a constant, rhythmic reminder that the past was now exactly where it belonged, beneath his feet. In the end, Han Jae-Wook didn't need a bullet to destroy Lee Bong-Gu. He destroyed him with the one thing a bully can't survive: insignificance. By letting him live as a servant, Jae-Wook proved that the monster from his past was nothing more than a speck of dust on a marble floor. True power isn't about how many enemies you bury. It's about how many you can force to watch you succeed while they remain in the dirt. If this story of ultimate revenge moved you, don't let the silence end here. Hit the like button if you believe the best revenge is living well. Subscribe and turn on post notifications to join our elite circle for more tales of power and justice. Comment below, would you have pulled the trigger, or is Jae-Wook's mercy truly more terrifying? Share this with someone who needs to know that their past doesn't define their future. We'll see you in the next one.